An account of the persecutions of Michael de Molinos, a native of Spain. Michael de Molinos, a Spaniard of a rich and honorable family, entered, when young, into priest's orders, but would not accept any of preferment in the church. He possessed great natural abilities which he dedicated to the service of his fellow creatures, without any view of emolument to himself. His course of life was pious and uniform, nor did he exercise those austerities which are common among the religious orders of the Church of Rome. Being of a contemplative turn of mind, he pursued the track of the mystical divines, and having acquired great reputation in Spain, and being desirous of propagation his sublime mode of devotion, he left his own country and settled at Rome. Here he soon connected himself with some of the most distinguished among the literati, who so approved of his religious maxims that they concurred in assisting him to propagate them, and in a short time he obtained a great number of followers who, for the sublime mode of their religion, were distinguished by the name of Quietists. In 1675, Molinos published a book entitled Il Guida Spiritual, to which were subjoined recommendatory letters from several great personages. One of these was by the Archbishop of Reggio, a second by the General of the Franciscans, and a third by Father Martin de Esparza, a Jesuit who had been divinity professor both at Salamanca and Rome. No sooner was the book published than it was greatly read and highly esteemed, both in Italy and Spain, and this so raised the reputation of the author that his acquaintance was coveted by the most respectable characters. Letters were written to him from numbers of people, so that a correspondence was settled between him and those who approved of his method in different parts of Europe. Some secular priests, both at Rome and Naples, declared themselves openly for it and consulted him as a sort of oracle on many occasions. But those who attached themselves to him with the greatest sincerity were some of the fathers of the oratory, in particular, three of the most eminent, namely, KIII, Sisori, and Petrucci. Many of the cardinals also courted his acquaintance, and thought themselves happy in being reckoned among the number of his friends. The most distinguished of them was the Cardinal de Estoril, a man of very great learning, who so highly approved of Molinos' maxims that he entered into a close connection with him. They conversed together daily, and notwithstanding the distrust a Spaniard has naturally of a Frenchman, yet Molinos, who was sincere in his principles, opened his mind without reserve to the cardinal, and by this means a correspondence was settled between Molinos and some distinguished characters in France. Whilst Molinos was thus laboring to propagate his religious mode, Father Petrucci wrote several treatises relative to a contemplative life, but he mixed in them so many rules for the devotions of the Romish Church as mitigated that censure he might have otherwise incurred. They were written chiefly for the use of the nuns, and therefore the sense was expressed in the most easy and familiar style. Molinos had now acquired such reputation that the Jesuits and Dominicans began to be greatly alarmed and determined to put a stop to the progress of his method. To do this, it was necessary to decry the author of it, and as heresy is an imputation that makes the strongest impression at Rome, Molinos and his followers were given out to be heretics. Books were also written by some of the Jesuits against Molinos and his method, but they were all answered with spirit by Molinos. These disputes occasioned such disturbance in Rome that the whole affair was taken notice of by the Inquisition. Molinos and his book, and Father Petrucci with his treatises and letters, were brought under a severe examination, and the Jesuits were considered as the accusers. One of the society had indeed approved of Molinos' book, but the rest took care he should not be again seen at Rome. In the course of the examination, both Molinos and Petrucci acquitted themselves so well that their books were again approved, and the answers with which the Jesuits had written were censured as scandalous. Petrucci's conduct on this occasion was so highly approved that it not only raised the credit of the cause, but his own emolument, for he was soon after made Bishop of Gessis, which was a new declaration made by the Pope in their favor. Their books were now esteemed more than ever, their method was more followed, and the novelty of it with the new approbation given after so vigorous an accusation by the Jesuits, all contributed to raise the credit and increase the number of the party. The behavior of Father Petrucci and his new dignity greatly contributed to increase his reputation, so that his enemies were unwilling to give him any further disturbance, and indeed there was less occasion given for censure by his writings than those of Molinos. Some passages in the latter were not so cautiously expressed, but there was room to make exceptions to them, while on the other hand, Petrucci so fully explained himself as easily to remove the objections made to some parts of his letter. The great reputation acquired by Molinos and Petrucci occasioned a daily increase of the Quietists. All who were thought sincerely devout, or at least affected the reputation of it, were reckoned among the number. If these persons were observed to become more strict in their lives and mental devotions, yet there appeared less zeal in their whole department at the exterior parts of the church ceremonies. They were not so assiduous at Mass, nor so earnest to procure Masses to be said for their friends, nor were they so frequently either at confession or in processions. Though the new approbation given to Molinos' book by the Inquisition had checked the proceedings of his enemies, yet they were still inveterate against him in their hearts, and determined if possible to ruin him. They insinuated that he had all designs and was in his heart an enemy to the Christian religion, that under pretense of raising men to a sublime strain of devotion, he intended to erase from their minds a sense of the mysteries of Christianity, and because he was a Spaniard, they gave out that he was a descendant from a Jewish or Mahometan race, and that he might carry in his blood or in his first education some seeds of those religions which he had since cultivated with no less art than zeal. This last calumny gained but little credit at Rome, though it was said as an order was sent to examine the registers of the place where Molinos was baptized. Molinos, finding himself attacked with great vigor and the most unrelenting malice, took every necessary precaution to prevent these imputations being credited. He wrote a treatise entitled Frequent and Daily Communion, which was likewise approved by some of the most learned and Romish clergy. This was printed with his spiritual guide in the year 1675, and in the preface to it he declared that he had not written it with any design to engage himself in matters of controversy, but that it was drawn from him by the earnest solicitations of many pious people. The Jesuits, failing in their attempts of crushing Molinos' power in Rome, applied to the court of France, when in a short time they so far exceeded that an order was sent to Cardinal d'Estrees, commanding him to prosecute Molinos with all possible rigor. The cardinal, though strongly attached to Molinos, resolved to sacrifice all that is sacred in friendship to the will of his master. Finding, however, there was not sufficient matter for an accusation against him, he determined to supply that defect himself. He therefore went to the inquisitors and informed them of several particulars, not only relative to Molinos, but also Petrucci, of whom, together with several of their friends, were put in the Inquisition. When they were brought before the inquisitors, which was the beginning of the year 1684, Petrucci answered the respective questions put to him with so much judgment and temper that he was soon dismissed, and though Molinos' examination was much longer, it was generally expected he would have been likewise discharged, but this was not the case. Though the inquisitors had not any accusation against him, yet they strained every nerve to find him guilty of heresy. They first objected to his holding a correspondence in different parts of Europe, but of this he was acquitted, as the matter of that correspondence could not be made criminal. They then directed their attention to some suspicious papers found in his chamber, but Molinos so clearly explained their meaning that nothing could be made of them to his prejudice. At length, Cardinal d'Estrees, after producing the order sent to him by the King of France for prosecuting Molinos, said he could prove against him more than was necessary to convince them he was guilty of heresy. To do this, he perverted the meaning of some passages in Molinos' books and papers, and related many false and aggravating circumstances relative to the prisoner. He acknowledged he had lived with him under the appearance of friendship, but that it was only to discover his principles and intentions, that he had found them to be of a bad nature, and that dangerous consequences were likely to ensue. But in order to make a full discovery, he had assented to several things which in his heart he detested, and that by these means he saw into the secrets of Molinos, but determined not to take any notice until a proper opportunity should offer of crushing him and his followers. In consequence of d'Estrees' evidence, Molinos was closely confined by the Inquisition, where he continued for some time, during which period all was quiet, and his followers prosecuted their mode without interruption. But on a sudden, the Jesuits determined to extirpate them, and the storm broke out with the most inveterate vehemence. The Count Vespiani and his lady, Don Polo Rocci, confessor to the Prince Borghese, and some of his family, with several others, in all 70 persons, were put into the Inquisition, among whom many were highly esteemed for their learning and piety. The accusation laid against the clergy was their neglecting to say the breviary, and the rest were accused of going to the communion without first attending confession. In a word, it was said they neglected all their exterior parts of religion and gave themselves up wholly to solitude and inward prayer. The Countess Vespiani exerted herself in a very particular manner on her examination before the inquisitors. and the rest were accused of going to the communion without first attending confession. In a word, it was said they neglected all their exterior parts of religion and gave themselves up wholly to solitude and inward prayer. The Countess Vespiani exerted herself in a very particular manner on her examination before the inquisitors. She said she had never revealed her method of devotion to any mortal but her confessor, and that it was impossible they should know it without his discovering the secret, that therefore it was time to give over going to confession if priests made this use of it, to discover the most secret thoughts entrusted to them, that for the future she would only make her confession to God. From this spirited speech, and the great noise made in consequence of the Countess's situation, the inquisitors thought it most prudent to dismiss both her and her husband, lest the people might be incensed, and what she said might lessen the credit of confession. They were therefore both discharged, but bound to appear whenever they should be called upon. Besides those already mentioned, such was the inveteracy of the Jesuits against the Quietists, that within the space of a month, upwards of 200 persons were put into the Inquisition, and that method of devotion which has passed in Italy as the most elevated to which mortals could aspire, was deemed heretical, and the chief promoters of it confined in a wretched dungeon. In order, if possible, to extirpate Quietism, the inquisitors sent a circular letter to Cardinal Thibault as the chief minister to disperse it through Italy. It was addressed to all prelates, informed them that whereas many schools and fraternities were established in several parts of Italy, in which some persons, under the pretense of leading people into the ways of the Spirit and to the prayer of quietness, instilled into them many abominable heresies, therefore a strict charge was given to dissolve all those societies and to oblige the spiritual guide to tread in known paths, and in particular to take care that none of that sort should be suffered to have the direction of the nunneries. Orders were likewise given to proceed in the way of justice against those who should be found guilty of these abominable errors. After this, a strict inquiry was made into all the nunneries of Rome, when most of their directors and confessors were discovered to be engaged in this new method. It was found that the Carmelites, the nuns of the Conception, and those of several other convents were wholly given up to prayer and contemplation, and that instead of their beads and the other devotions to saints or images, they were much alone and often in exercise of mental prayer. And when they were asked why they had laid aside the use of their beads and their ancient forms, their answer was that their directors had advised them to do so. Information of this being given to the Inquisition, they sent orders that all books written in the same strain with those of the Molinos and Petrucci should be taken from them, and that they should be compelled to return to their original form of devotion. The circular letter sent to Cardinal Thibault produced but little effect, for most of the Italian bishops were inclined to Molinos' method. It was intended that this, as well as other orders from the inquisitors, should be kept secret, but notwithstanding all their care, copies of it were printed and dispersed in most of the principal towns in Italy. This gave great uneasiness to the inquisitors, who used every method they could to conceal their proceedings from the knowledge of the world. They blamed the cardinal and accused him of being the cause of it, but he retorted on them, and his secretary laid the fault on both. During these transactions, Molinos suffered great indignities from the officers of the Inquisition, and the only comfort he received was being sometimes visited by Father Petrucci. Though he had lived in the highest reputation in Rome for some years, he was now as much despised as he had been admired, being generally considered as one of the worst of heretics. The greater part of Molinos' followers who had been placed in the Inquisition, having abjured his mode, were dismissed, but a harder fate awaited Molinos, their leader. After lying a considerable time in prison, he was at length brought again before the inquisitors to answer a number of articles exhibited against him from his writings. As soon as he appeared in court, a chain was put around his body and a wax light in his hand, when two friars read aloud the articles of accusation. Molinos answered each with great steadiness and resolution, and notwithstanding his arguments totally defeated the force of all, yet he was found guilty of heresy and condemned to imprisonment for life. When he left the court, he was attended by a priest who had borne him the greatest respect. On his arrival at the prison, he entered the cell allotted for his confinement with great tranquility, and on taking leave of the priest, thus addressed him, quote, "Adieu, Father. We shall meet again at the day of judgment, and then it will appear on which side the truth is, whether on my side or on yours." End quote. During his confinement, he was several times tortured in the most cruel manner, until at length the severity of the punishments overpowered his strength and finished his existence. The death of Molinos struck such an impression on his followers. During his confinement, he was several times tortured in the most cruel manner, until at length the severity of the punishments overpowered his strength and finished his existence. That the greater part of them soon abjured his mode, and by the assiduity of the Jesuits, Quietism was totally extirpated throughout the country.